Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's keynote address, using SEL skills to pursue the common good with our trailblazing speaker, Mr. David Adams. I'm John Pickens, the program manager with Harmony SEL. This session is being recorded, and you'll be able to access the video from your virtual attendee hub. Now, at this time, we cannot see you and your microphones are off, so we definitely encourage you to use the question and answer box to the right and to ask questions and engage during our session. Time permitting, we will have a brief period of question and answer at the end. And it's my honor and my privilege to introduce our dynamic speaker, Mr. David Adams, the CEO of the Urban Assembly. Now, for me to cover all of David's accolades would take up the entire session. So instead, I ask you to review his bio in the attendee hub. And you can also learn more by reading his book, purchase his book on Amazon, The Educator's Practical Guide to Emotional Intelligence, available again on Amazon. Now, without further ado, I'm passing the mic to David Adams. Greetings, sir, and welcome.
John, thank you so much for that introduction. And I want to give a special thank you to Harmony and Inspire for helping to sponsor SEL Day. If you go to selday.org, you'll learn more about the work that we are doing to inspire social and emotional learning across the world. But we're not going to talk about that today. Today, we're going to talk about a really specific concept. And the topic of our keynote today is from knowing to being, using SEL skills to pursue the common good. And I'm going to get into this conversation for a keynote with this story. So way back when I was a college student at Rutgers University, one of my buddies asked if I could join him for his birthday. Being a good friend, I said, absolutely. And met a group of guys over at a restaurant. So I walked into the restaurant, I sat down, I looked at the menu, opened it up, and realized immediately there was going to be a little bit of a problem here. You see, being a college student, I was what we call financially constrained. And this restaurant was what we call financially unconstrained. So I thought about this very quickly, and I took the only approach that a college student would, and I'm sure you guys have appreciated this at one point in time. I looked at the soup, I offered liberal helpings of water, and even though the waitress looked at me kind of funny as I made my order, I knew that I was doing what I could in order to participate in the community. So everything was going well. I was really excited about my effectiveness in problem solving until the bill came. Now, I'm sure you guys have all had a situation where there's a number of people out and the bill comes and yeah, you're trying to think about a question. How do you maintain community, camaraderie, while being fair around the bill? Well, we all looked at each other for about 5 to 10 seconds, and this is what we call a Texas standoff. We had 3 options. Number 1, we can split the bill right down the middle. Now, you know, I did not just spend 45 minutes sipping on miso soup and having 4 glasses of water to take the option of paying for everybody's glasses of sake. Then we also had this option of everybody paying their own way. And I'm sure you guys have been in this situation where the questions of who ordered the refill, how do we make sure that the second helping of French fries is accounted for? It's a contentious way to do it, but it has its own merits. And then lastly, there was my preference, which is the birthday boy pays for everybody else. Now, he had the pleasure of our company for 45 minutes. I thought this might not be a bad way to repay us for hanging out on his birthday. Now, before we get into how we solve this problem, I'm going to talk about the prerequisites of the question, some of the underlying themes that allow us to pursue the outcomes. First, this notion of community. We had come together in community. We had some shared values, identities, networks that bonded us through a commitment of reciprocity. And it helped us be willing to work through the common interest. You see, the fact that we had bonds helped us motivate us to pursue an outcome that we in our group could get behind. We had a common interest of not looking petty in front of the waitress, and of course, maintaining our friendship. This notion of community is so important when talking about the common good. Perceptions of community drive our willingness to pursue a common interest. We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union. But unlike our group, our country has sometimes struggled to define the we. In her new book, Some of Us, What Racism Cost Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, Heather McGhee speaks to this notion of community writing. The civil rights movement, which widened the circle of public beneficiaries, could have heralded a more moral, prosperous nation, but ended up diminishing white people's commitment to the very idea of public goods themselves. In the late 1950s, over 2/3 of white Americans agreed with the now radical idea that government ought to guarantee a job for anyone who wants one and ensure a minimum standard of living for everyone in the country. White support nosedived for these ideas from 70% to 35% around 1960 to 1964. And has remained low ever since. Her central metaphor is that of towns and cities who close their public pools rather than share them with Black people, leaving everyone who couldn't afford a private pool materially worse off. 2 generations ago, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. echoed similar sentiments as he completed his last March to Selma in 1965. Speaking to a crowd of thousands, he said that the Southern aristocracy took the world and gave the poor white man Jim Crow. He said he gave them Jim Crow, and when his wrinkled stomach cried out for the food that his empty pockets could not provide, he ate Jim Crow, a psychological bird that told him no matter how bad off he was, at least he was a white man better than a Black man. And he ate Jim Crow. And when his undernourished children cried out for the necessities that his low wages could not provide, he showed them the Jim Crow signs on the buses and in the stores and on the streets and in the public buildings. And his children too learned to feed upon Jim Crow. And so we return to this question of the common good and how we will pursue it, and the role social emotional competencies play in this pursuit. You see, social and emotional learning focuses us on how we relate to ourselves and others in the pursuit of problem solving. And what greater problem can we solve than living together in a community of justice? Social awareness. Students demonstrate an awareness of the role and values of the greater community. Adults around me show me how to care for others and how to contribute to bettering our community through their actions and the opportunities they provide me. We work through this concept at the Urban Assembly through the establishment of a social contract, where students talk about how they will treat each other and how to make amends when these norms are broken. Inevitably, when we have this discussion with our kids, the question of who is in our community comes up. Our classroom, our advisory, our school. The question, as with most things in life, is left to our young people to navigate, just as we've been navigating this question in our country for 250 years. Who is our community? And what is our relationship to each other? Relationship skills. Students develop constructive relationships. Adults around me show me what constructive relationships look like, sound like, and feel like through their actions and words. See, I spent a lot of time thinking about the difference between constructive and destructive, to build versus destroy. If you look up the word union, the definition will read a state of being united, a combination, as the result of 2 or more things joining into one, a more perfect union. What kind of union do we want to be in? What kind of relationships will our communities develop with each other? Constructive, ones that build, that create, that result in that more perfect union our forefathers imagined? Or destructive, one that substitutes grievance for governance? What are our adults showing our young people? What do we believe that we're capable of? There are folks that don't believe a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy is feasible, that a nation who put a man on the moon and won 2 world wars is capable of resolving these differences peacefully. I disagree. but we can't see each other as enemies, bound to replicate our oppression through some karmic dance. We need to envision a society of justice, in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, where no one would prey upon the weakness of others. Society of brotherhood, where every man would respect the dignity and worth of human personality. That is a society that is better for everyone. That is a society that reflects a more perfect union. So how do we get there? First, kids need a social and emotional education so that they are no longer content to be fed the psychological bird of resentment and return to the charge from our founding fathers to form a more perfect union. Our schools must reflect the values we seek to develop in our youth. In fact, right now, there are organizations like I Thrive Games who develops or opportunities like the I Thrive Sim, where students take on roles like Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense in order to learn how to balance personal interests and the larger good, personal and social responsibility, perspective taking, community, constructive discourse. These are American values. These are social and emotional skills. Second, we need to address the resegregation of America's schools. Students who don't learn in diverse communities will not live in diverse communities, and students who do not live in community with others are not equipped to pursue the common good for all. Lastly, we need to raise the purpose of our public schools beyond math and science factories. We must acknowledge that our social engineers contribute as much to our communities as their more mathematically minded counterparts. For what use is a sturdy bridge if the society around it crumbles? In the words of philosopher Neil Postman, public education does not serve a public, it creates a public. And in creating the right kind of public, the schools contribute towards strengthening the spiritual basis of the American creed. That's how Jefferson understood it, how Horace Mann understood it, how John Dewey understood it, and in fact, there is no way else to understand it. The question is not, does or doesn't public schools create the public? The question is, what kind of public does it create? A conglomerate of self-indulgent consumers, angry, soulless, directionless masses, indifferent, confused citizens, or a public imbued with confidence, a sense of purpose, a respect for learning and tolerance? The answer to this question has nothing to do with whatever computers or testing or teaching accountability or class size or other details of managing schools. No, the answer depends on two things and two things alone: the existence of shared narratives and the capacity of such narratives to provide an inspired reason for schooling. End quote. Who we are is just as important as what we know. Now, I know I never finished that story about the meal that I had way back when, and I confess I don't actually remember how we resolved that problem. But I do know that we're all still friends to this day. And if a group of financially constrained college students can pursue the common good, then our nation can too. Thank you.
Outstanding speech, sir. Powerful words and opens up for questions. So I would ask the first question as our questions are coming in. How do you structure some of these conversations with your peers and colleagues that may not be as comfortable having these conversations as you would like them to be?
John, that's a great question, right? I think that one of the concepts around social emotional learning is self-awareness, right? Understanding our emotions, our needs and wants. One of the things I think that's important when we think about discourse and how we speak across difference is understanding what the goal is. And in fact, the goal is to pursue some common good. The goal is to pursue community. The goal is to maintain relationships. So the first thing that I think we need to do is make sure that everybody understands that our goal here is to construct, to build, to develop, not to destroy. The second thing I think is when we're having those conversations, we got to understand that we're going to hear some things that don't make us feel good. There are some folks, you know, who didn't really appreciate the idea that the birthday boy should pay us as a payment for his opportunity to have our presence, but it's an idea, right? And so when we sit in these conversations, we need to have these spaces in which we are looking for windows and mirrors, right? Windows are perspectives into somebody else's experience, and windows is when we see ourselves in the experience of others. And our goal through discourse, our goal through applying these social and emotional skills through the common good is to create that community. And we can only have community when we start to see ourselves in each other. And that takes dialogue.
Very good point. I agree 100%. So a question that comes up, well, a couple questions. One is, which was in my head and I could have asked, how do we convince the birthday boy to pay for us when it's his birthday and we're supposed to be celebrating him? But another one that came up that I want to ask, because we get it also at Harmony quite a bit, is this person works in a school in Baton Rouge and it's a math and literacy school. And their question is, there doesn't seem to be as much time in the day that they wish to focus on SEL. So how can they fit SEL into their lessons?
It's a great question, right? So we got to think about all learning has social and emotional properties, right? If you think about Vygotsky and his zone of proximal development, he identified the difference between what we could do independently, what we can do with adult or peer support. And that support is not just instructional scaffolds, it's also emotional scaffolds. My sons have been home for about a year now in online learning, and I noticed that when they have trouble reading, a lot of times I just sit down and say, all right, let's just sound this out. And they sound the first word and they sound the second letter and they've got the word, right? I actually didn't add anything to that space except for a sense of adult or adult support, right? So the first thing we got to understand is all learning is social and emotional. All learning involves frustration. All learning involves problem solving. These things are social, emotional, cognitive skills. And so when we understand that, then we start to think about how do we organize instructional formats in a way that activate these skills and support our students to be intentional about that activation. We do turn-in talks all the time. Some students are good at this, some students are not. But how often do we do turn-in talks and explicitly activate your active listening skills that you're going to need to be successful in that exchange of ideas? We know that exchanging ideas means one person is telling, the other person is listening. Right? If we have just one person telling the other person thinking about life, we haven't hit the instructional outcome, which is an exchange of development, or the social emotional outcome, which is learning how to listen. The last thing I'll say, and I said this in our talk today, is that a bridge from one place to another, a physical bridge, while the actual society around us crumbles, is not a bridge worth building. We got to recognize that we need more than just engineers in our society to allow us to live in community. We need the folks who can solve the problems. We need the folks who can build coalitions. We need the folks who build the virtual bridges, the emotional bridges, the social bridges from generation to generation and from community to community, so that we can make sure that we got something to leave our kids that is worth giving to them. So I'm just gonna say it one more time. You know, I appreciate it. In the Army, I was an engineer. I joined the Engineer Corps as an engineer officer for 4 years. I appreciate bridge building. What it means, but I also want to recognize the type of bridges that we need to build in our communities so that we can be successful in leaving a legacy to our young people.
Very good. Thank you for that. And thank you for kind of doing a deeper dive into it. I think we toss around the term building bridges so often, but I like that you did a deeper dive and explain a little deeper into it. Another question that comes to mind, it's a really good one that someone asked: what life experiences inspired you to focus specifically on SEL regarding race and community?
Oh, that's a great question. So I've been in the military for 18 years. I went down, I did my basic at Fort Knox back then when we did basic training. Back then it was all male. It wasn't co-ed. Home of the Armor. I did my basic officer leadership training in Fort Leonard Wood. And back when I was in basic training, one of the things that I really learned was about different people in our country, right? I remember a young guy, I guess he was the same age as I was, but he said, we got our greens, our dress greens back then, now we were blues. He said, this is my first suit. And I was like, yeah, it's our first suit, because it was the first time the Army had given us a suit. He's like, no, it wasn't my first Army suit. It was just my first suit, period. right? And he was from, I don't remember where, it must be maybe Alabama. He was a white guy. And I remember just really changing the way that I understood the world, right? I was in college, most of the folks were not. This was when I was enlisted. I was enlisted for 14 years. And I came to understand that the only way to build connection, right, is to have some sort of larger principle that we're all working towards. You can't just walk into the room and be in relationship with somebody. You can't just walk into a space and be in community. We have to believe in something beyond ourselves. We have to believe in something bigger than our immediate identity. And when we do that, then we have that common bond that allows us to solve problems, right? Back in our story, we just wanted to not look bad in front of the waitress because we all were poor. And my friend who invited us neglected to tell us that he had a taste for the upper class of life. So we all looked at each other and had some similar thoughts. How are we going to make this happen? So that community, that relationship needs to be something that is intentional. That's something that's forged through struggle, through difficulty. And in fact, I've been a big proponent of national service today. It doesn't just have to be the military. It can be city year, it could be AmeriCorps. But as Americans, we need something to relate to each other about beyond some of the challenges that we face in our community. So the work around social and emotional learning has inspired me to recognize the lessons from the military, which is that we all need to be looking at the same direction. We all need to be understanding who we are in a greater space in order to form the communities that allow us to move forward. I'll tell you one last story briefly. As I said, I became a second lieutenant in 2016. And when I was going to basic officer leadership course and engineer corps, I met a guy from Boston. He told me, you can always tell who the veterans are in Boston because it's the only time that you see the Black people and white people hanging out. He said, those are always the Vietnam vets because they have some experience that is more important than the racial strife that kind of defined Boston to him. So those are experiences that help me recognize what it means to be in community, to be in a relationship, and what it takes to maintain that under some of the challenges that we have in our lives.
Very powerful and very personal story. And I can relate to a lot of that. I'm also a veteran, I'm a Navy man. And some of those same experiences that you talked about, interacting with people from all different walks of life and that have lots of different experiences that are different from what you've experienced. And so that's really helpful. A couple other questions and comments I want to jump into. One, sure. Someone said, and I agree with this 100%, as an educator, I need to remember students have ideas as well. And I don't know everything, and they love the students' insight. And that's really important for us to remember as educators, as people in general, educators, parents. And then there's a question there. Someone's asking for a list of resources for parents as they're learning from home. So I'm wondering if you want
around
to
social and emotional learning?
Around social emotional learning, yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, I think CASEL, I'm on the board of CASEL, so I got a plug for my peoples there. They do a great job at putting out some wonderful resources. Obviously, we're being sponsored here by Harmony Programs. Harmony Programs has invested a lot in making sure that there are some free opportunities and free resources. So I would say the simple thing to do there is just to Google social and emotional learning activities for home. Just be careful, I think, when we're talking about parents that we're doing things in community, right? We're inviting parents to talk about how we can support the social and emotional development. It's not something that only schools do, right? Sports support social and emotional development. Instruction support social and emotional development. Parents do, churches do, community organization, Boys and Girls Club, after school. Everything that has a social and emotional component, which is everything, has an impact on how students develop their social and emotional skills. So just think about how we invite folks in to understand what is our intent, what are we trying to accomplish with the social and emotional outcomes that we're organizing our experiences around in schools, so that parents can have an opportunity to give their sense around how they can do that at home as well.
Very powerful. And I like the points that you make that SEL touches every aspect of life, every aspect of our education. So making sure that we're mindful of that at all times. Another question, and this is a good question. They're all good questions, but do you have hope for future generations will be able to shed the psychological burden that you mentioned, or will we always be working towards it?
I think the answer is both, right? You know, it's interesting, we talk about problem solving. Folks, I was in the third grade classroom one time, and not one of our schools over at the Urban Assembly, but a different school, and I asked them, how school prepared you to solve problems. And they all looked at me like, and they all raised their hand, and she was like, math problems? And I was like, okay, yeah, those are an example of problems you solve. And then I said, any other kind of problems? And they looked at me like really, really blank. And they said, fractions, right? The only experience that they had had in terms of intentional development of problem solving had come in the context of mathematical concepts. So we talked about, what about problems with your brother or your sister, or problems of being in relationship? And they're like, no, we don't really do that much in our school. But we're seeing now that social and emotional learning and social and emotional development is moving from this thing that you do when kids have trauma, or for kids who are struggling, or kids in the city, to a foundational notion of what it means to contribute to our society. A foundational notion about what it means to participate in democracy. If we can't resolve conflicts through dialogue, if we can't take the perspective of other people in our communities, if we can't communicate, then we're going to struggle to move into the new era of our nation, which is a multi-ethnic and multiracial democracy. So I would say I have faith in our young people. I've seen our young people come to the table and really think about, I want to be in a relationship. What does that mean? Yeah, and this sounds ridiculous, John, but I've seen folks on like Reddit boards and like social media, and they're like, they just come together in a community. Hey, look, this is a community about, mustaches, and this is what we care about. And if you want to be part of this community, I need you to think about these things and how we respect people in these ways. And then the moderators come up and they're like, hey, we don't do beards here. We only do mustaches. I wonder if we can work this out so that you can still be part of that community. And you see this in towns now in terms of social media. Now, every town has their own kind of, social media space. And it's not always pretty, don't get me wrong, right? But you see these people participating in democracy, participating in community. And as long as we have this notion that at the end of the day, our goal is to be in more perfect union, right? And that's not my words, right? Obviously, these are the words of the Constitution. These are not Black people words, although Black people were the people who stopped and said, let's make this happen in real life. Let's talk about how we can actually actualize a community that involves all the citizens of our nation. So I've got faith. I do believe we'll always be looking to perfect our union. I think we'll always sit down and say, what does it look like today? Are we doing goatees or are we doing full beards? We're going to have to make a decision about what this community looks like. But that's the beauty of being a self-governing nation, right? That's the beauty of being American, is that we can continually work on these things so that we can give our next generation another shot to get a little bit better.
Outstanding. Very strong start, very powerful middle, and a fantastic closing. So at this time, I want to thank David for his powerful words and his inspiring thoughts. And then I'd like to thank everyone for attending. Thank you all for being here. Take a quick break before going to your next session. And remember to use your note catcher documents when you go into your session to help guide your learning and to use during your breakout. Also, remember you can find this recording in your attendee hub, as well as the recording for your other sessions. At the end of the day, we're going to have that survey so you can let us know how well we did. I'm sure you're all giving David a round of applause because, again, he was an amazing speaker. Again, you can find his book on Amazon, and his contact information will be available as well. Thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of your evening.